Welcome everyone to the Hoover Institution workshop on using text as data in policy analysis. My name is Stephen Davis and I organized the workshop with Justin Grimmer. We feature applications of natural language processing, structured human readings, and machine learning methods to text as data. We use these methods to consider policy relevant questions in economics, history, national security, political science, education, and other fields. And today we're delighted to have Barbara Biasi and Song Ma, who will speak about their work on the education innovation gap. Both are on the faculty at the Yale School of Management. Barbara earned her PhD in economics from Stanford, and Song earned his in finance from Duke's Fuqua School of Business. So the plan is we'll run the workshop about the recorded session of this workshop for about 65 minutes. Barbara and Song will start off with a presentation for 35 minutes. We will limit questions in that segment to just clarifying questions. If you want to ask a question, please use the Q&A function that you'll find. And you're more likely to be called on if you state what your question is, especially if there's a surplus of questions. Justin and I will moderate the questions. We may just restate your question or let you ask Sarah, who's working behind the scenes here, to let you speak online. And after the kind of more formal session that's recorded, we'll go offline for an unrecorded session and a more informal discussion. If you've got some question about how to do certain things, this is really designed for people who want to learn how to do this type of analysis as well. So without further ado, Barbara and Song, the floor is yours.
Thanks a lot to Stephen, Justin for the invitation, and we're really happy to present our work. The title of this project is The Education Innovation Gap. And the broad motivation for this paper is a concept that really underlines the idea of a knowledge economy, which is that ideas and knowledge generate growth. And because they're so important, we think it makes sense to understand how they're produced, but also disseminated across the economy. We think that education programs, and in particular higher education programs, are likely to play a big role in this. However, we also know that there are a lot of differences across programs, both across and within schools, in terms of the type of education that they're able to offer their students, in terms of the returns that they generate, and in general, in terms of the whole education experience. And so what we're going to try to do in this paper is quantify a particular dimension of this heterogeneity that relates to the dissemination of frontier knowledge. And in particular, we're going to try to understand to what extent each higher education program is able to equip students with what we are going to call frontier knowledge. Frontier knowledge in our mind is knowledge that has just been produced, that is very new. The way that we're going to do this is by using the text of several million university and college syllabi as a source of data to construct a new measure, which we are going to call the education innovation gap. And the idea behind this measure is exactly to measure the extent to which the knowledge that is taught in a given course is up to date with respect to the research frontier. The way that we're going to construct this education innovation gap is essentially by comparing the text of course syllabi as a proxy for the knowledge content of a given course with the text of academic publications in the same field as a course published at different points in time. And once we have done this, we're going to construct our measure as essentially a ratio of similarities of a given course with papers that were published many years ago versus papers that were published, say, the prior year. And intuitively, a course will have a lower education innovation gap if it is more similar to newer research than it is to older research, and vice versa. Once we construct this measure, we're going to do a couple exercises to validate it and to make sure that it really captures what we want it to capture. We're going to show that the education innovation gap correlates pretty well with the average age of the references contained in each syllabus. These are, books or academic articles that are listed as mandatory or optional readings for people who take the course. We're also going to do a simulation exercise in which we're going to manually substitute the word content of each syllabus with the words that we consider new, that is, words that are most likely to be found in newer papers relative to older ones. And we're going to measure how much the gap changes as we replace more and more words. And we're going to find that the gap declines as we substitute the content of a syllabus with newer content, which is reassuring because it's basically telling us that the measure is doing what we want it to do. And then once we have done this validation exercises, we are going to essentially spend most of the time describing how the education innovation gap varies both across schools and within schools across courses taught by different people. And in particular, we're going to show that the gap correlates with some school level characteristics such as selectivity. We're going to show that the gap is lower in more selective schools. The gap is also lower for schools that have higher expenditure per student on things like instruction, faculty salary, as well as research. We're also going to document a fair amount of heterogeneity in the gap also within schools across courses. And in particular, we're going to find that the role of the instructor is, so of the person who's teaching the course, is particularly important. And we're going to show that courses that are taught by faculty who is more research active, as captured by the number of publications or the number of citations to past publications, as well as the number of grants as well. Those people who are more productive from a research standpoint are going to be teaching courses with a lower gap. We also have some recent analysis using salary data of the faculty, which hopefully I will have some time to talk about. And then in the very last part of the paper, we're going to try to establish a correlation between the education innovation gap measured this time at the school level with the outcomes of the students that graduate from each school. And in particular, we're going to be looking at graduation rates and incomes 10 years after graduation for different cohorts of students. We're going to find a positive or actually a negative correlation between the gap and these outcomes, which suggests that schools that have a lower gap, that have more up-to-date knowledge in their courses, also have better outcomes for their students. Of course, these are just correlations because we don't really have a source of quasi exogenous variation in the gap at this point, but that's exactly what Song and I, together with some other co-authors, are working on and thinking about at the moment. Okay. All right. So the outline for the rest of the talk, I apologize, is going to be as follows. I'm going to talk a little bit about the data. Then I will talk about the methodology. So essentially, I'm going to describe the measure, the way that we construct it, but also the way that we use the text of syllabi and academic publications as a source of data to construct this measure. Then I'm going to explain how this education innovation gap varies across schools and within schools across courses. And then I'm going to relate it to student outcomes. All right. So our starting point in terms of data is the text of 7 million course syllabi, which we acquired from Open Syllabus. Open Syllabus is a project that was initially hosted at Columbia University in New York. It's now a sort of independent venture. And what the Open Syllabus has been doing over time is collecting all the syllabi of courses and college and university courses that could be found online, either on the websites of the universities themselves or on the websites of the faculty, or in some cases, they also accepted voluntary contributions from faculty. We're going to be focusing our attention on a sample or on a subsample of a little less than 2 million syllabi of courses taught in 4-year US institutions between 1998 and 2018. This is going to leave us with courses at about a little less than 800 institutions, covering a little more than 60 fields. So we're going to have each course classified in one of many fields. For each course, we're gonna get a syllabus, and in particular, we're gonna get the text of each syllabus, which we are going to sort of manipulate to transform it in the form of data. So what in particular are we going to extract from each syllabus? The first thing that we're going to extract is the course code, which is, an alphanumeric code that denotes a specific course in a specific year. And often that code also remains the same for the same course over time. This course code is particularly useful, A, because it allows us to track the same course over time, presumably also as it is taught by different people over time. But also, in many cases, the course code allows us to establish whether a course is a basic undergraduate course or an advanced undergraduate course or a graduate level course. So I'm using here my own syllabus of a course that I taught a few years ago at the Yale SOM, and the code of my course is MGT 537. MGT at Yale denotes all courses that are taught at the School of Management, which implies that this is a graduate course, and in fact, it's an MBA course. The second piece of information that we're going to extract from the syllabi is the name of the instructor. You can see my information here on the box, in the box on the first page. This is going to be something that we're going to use to link our syllabi data to more data. We're then going to take extract information on the content of a course from typically a paragraph that is contained in the first page or in the first 2 pages of a syllabus that describes with a few sentences what the course is about. So what is the broad topic or topics that the course is going to cover. And then we're also going to use information on the references in each syllabus. These are essentially bibliographic references that refer to readings that the students are supposed to complete throughout the course. Okay, so this is the sort of main information that we're going to extract from the syllabi. This table here summarizes our syllabi sample. A couple interesting things here are the breakdown in terms of macro fields. As I said, we have over 60 kind of granular fields. We're going to aggregate them for some of our analysis at the macro field level. So we're going to have 4 of them. We can see that 32% of all courses are STEM courses, 11% are humanities, 11% are business, 30% are humanities, and the rest is social science courses. We also have a fairly even breakdown or distribution across course levels. 36% of all courses are basic undergraduate courses. These are courses of the first 2 years of a bachelor's degree. 29% of all courses are advanced undergraduate, and the rest, about 35%, are graduate courses. These are master and PhD. Actually, PhD are the minority, so most of them are masters. The second piece of data that we're going to connect to our syllabi data is information on all the articles that appeared in a journal in the top 10 within each field and year at least once starting from 1975. What does it mean to be in the top 10 in a field for a journal? It means to be in the top 10 when we rank all journals by impact factor. So we're going to take, if a journal appears at least once since 1975 in the top 10 by impact factor for each field, we're going to take that journal, we're going to take all the issues of that journal since the journal's foundation, and we're going to collect information on all the articles ever appeared in that journal. This is going to leave us with 18 million articles in 191 fields. So we're going to take this information from Scopus. And these articles are classified according to the Web of Science classification, which is slightly different from the classification that we use for the syllabi data. So we're going to create a crosswalk essentially manually, which we have in the gigantic appendix of the paper in case you're interested. What piece of information are we going to use from these publications? We're going to use the title, the name of the author, the abstract, which is going to be actually the primary source of the content of each article, as well as the keywords when they are available, and the publication year. So these are the pieces of information that we're going to use for each article. And we're going to use this information to establish where the research frontier in a given field is at each point in time. The third piece of data covers is information on the instructors, and in particular on the instructor's research output or productivity. So what we're going to do here is we're going to extract the name of the instructor from the syllabi, and we're going to search it through Microsoft Academic. Microsoft Academic is a search engine that works very similarly to Google Scholar. It's just, easier to access data, to work with its data. But it works very similarly. So for each person that we find in Microsoft Academic, this is a screenshot of what you would get a few months ago if you search for Songma in Microsoft Academic. You would get a list of his papers, and this include published papers as well as working papers, together with the counts of citations for each one of this entry. We are going to be able to find approximately 33% of all syllabi instructors into Microsoft Academic. And for sure, part of our inability to find some people might reflect the fact that we're essentially using text information, and there might be error or misspelling in the names of the instructors. But actually, we think that a lot of this kind of inability to match everybody actually reflects the fact that the majority of our instructors do not publish anything. And in fact, we're going to see that nearly half of our instructors are not tenured, are not on the tenure track nor tenured. So they're likely people who are focused on teaching rather than on research. In terms of instructors, we also have some data that we actually just finished cleaning, and we're sharing results for the first time. This is data on public research funding, and this includes the receipt of large government grants from the National Science Foundation and the National Institute of Health, which we collected from essentially the records of these two organizations. And what we did is essentially, again, searching for the instructor names through these records. We found that about 11% of all of our instructors have at least one grant from the NSF or the NIH during our time period of study, which we think is a reasonable number. And then the very last piece of information that we have on the instructors includes their job title and their pay. We have this information for a subset of instructors who work at public universities and colleges in certain states, and in particular in those states that publish this type of information online for accountability reasons. There are a lot of states where you can just Google and find a database of all people employed in public colleges and universities. You can see their name, you can see the salary for a given year, and you can see their job title. Okay, we're going to be able to find 10% of all instructors in this way, 14% of all public employees. This is just a summary of our instructor data. This is summary statistics on the publications, citations, and the grants. What I find interesting, most interesting perhaps because it's newest data that I'm very excited about, is information on the job titles and the breakdown of all instructors across job titles. Here is the statistic that I was mentioning before. So we have that 48% of our instructors are either adjunct or lecturer, so they're not on the tenure track. We have 11% of assistant professors, 13% of associate, 18% full, and then the rest, really a small minority, are practice or clinic professors or visiting professors. And this is just a summary of their pay, or how much money they're making. You can see here in the blue bars on the left of the slide, you can see the gradient that you would expect for people who are on the tenure track and people who are tenured. So you see that full professors make substantially more than associate and then full. And you also see that adjunct professors make considerably less compared even to assistant professors. So they're paid much less. Okay. The last piece of data that we're going to use is information at the school level or school by cohort level on some student outcomes, including graduation rates and earnings after graduation. Graduation rates are taken from IPEDS, which is a survey that all institutions in the US, higher education institutions who receive federal funding, have to complete. And earnings after graduation come from primarily from the college scorecard database, which reports this information for students 10 years after they graduate for several cohorts over time. And then we're going to use a host of school characteristics, which we are primarily going to use as controls, things like institutional characteristics, the selectivity level, the research intensity, public versus private. We're going to have some financial characteristics and expenditure, composition of the faculty and the student body. And we're also going to have median parental income for all students at each school, which actually comes from tax data aggregated at the school level by Cherry and his co-authors. So this is the pool of data that we're going to put together to do our analysis. So what are we going to do with this data? What we want to do is, again, build a measure that tells us how up to date the content of a course really is with respect to the research frontier. And so we want to construct these education innovation gaps such that a course has a lower gap if it is more similar to newer research than it is to older one. So our approach, perhaps not surprisingly, given that we are in this workshop, is going to be a text as data approach, where we're going to use as a source of data the text of the syllabi, compare it with the text of academic publications, calculate measures of textual similarity, and construct our measure based on this on the similarities. Now, let me go a little bit more in depth on the specific passages, because I think they might be of particular interest to this audience. So our starting point are going to be two sets of documents. We're going to have the syllabi, and we're going to have the papers, the academic publications. We're going to take these documents and, using a dictionary, which in our case is just going to be the list of all words that have ever had a Wikipedia entry. We're going to take this dictionary to give us a comprehensive sample of what we're going to call knowledge words, words that we think are able to capture the knowledge content of a given document. We're going to use this syllabus, use this dictionary, and we're going to represent each document as a word vector that is going to have the same length as the number of words that are in the dictionary, and which entries are going to be equal to zeros or ones, depending on whether a specific word in the dictionary is contained in the document or not. Okay, so from each document, we're going to get a word vector. We're going to go a step forward, that is, we're going to weight the elements of this vector in a way that gives more weight to words that are more frequently used in a given, say, syllabus or in a given paper, relative to their frequency in all the other documents that have been published up until the point in which that particular document is published. Why are we doing this? We call this the term frequency backward inverse frequency weighting, which is a very fancy term or acronym. The intuition behind it is that we want to account for the fact that certain words are just more frequently used in the English language compared to others, and also account for the fact that the frequency with which certain words are being used over time might change. So think about the term machine learning. The term machine learning perhaps is, especially within certain fields, is much more used now across syllabi or papers than it was 20 years ago. So we want to account for that. And we also want to account for the fact that, if a course talks about machine learning only once, and a course talks about machine learning 10 times, probably the second course is much more intensive on machine learning than the first one. This is the intuition behind this weighting. So once we have these weighted vectors of weighted document vectors, we're going to calculate a measure of textual similarity that is going to be the cosine similarity. This is just a measure of literally vectorial proximity between each syllabus and each paper published at different points in time. Then for each syllabus, we're going to take the average cosine similarity with all papers published at different points in time. And we're going to define our education innovation gap as the ratio between the average cosine similarity with papers published 15 years prior to the syllabus and the average cosine similarity with papers published the year prior to when the syllabus was taught. This is, in a nutshell, how we're going to conduct our text analysis, how we're going to go from the text of syllabi and documents and papers to this one measure that we're going to use in our analysis. If there are clarifying questions, I think this is a good moment to pause and see if I have been unclear. Otherwise, I will continue.
You've been very clear so far, and we don't have any questions yet.
Perfect. Okay. So once we have constructed this measure, of course, this is a sort of convoluted process. So we ask ourselves, well, is our measure really capturing what we wanted to capture? So what we did is a couple validation exercises. The first one is a very simple one. We thought, okay, if a syllabus is more likely to contain older knowledge relative to newer one, it is going to have presumably a higher gap, but it's also going to be more likely to cite or to report older readings, older references compared to newer ones. So we thought of correlating our education innovation gap with the average reference age for all the references that each syllabus contains. And we get that the correlation is positive, luckily, and is also statistically significant. So this is reassuring. The second validation exercise that we did was a simulation exercise. So we thought we took a sample of 100,000 syllabi. We tried to be as representative as possible in terms of distribution across fields. And we gradually, for each syllabus, replaced part of the content with what we call newer words or new words. That is, words that are in the top 5% of the distribution of words in terms of frequency among all papers that were published last year. So the year prior to the syllabus. This is an example of like newer knowledge. So, and then we measured how much each syllabus's gap changed as we replaced more and more of its content with newer content. And what we found is that the gap progressively declines as we replace the content with newer content, which is also very reassuring. It also declines in a relatively linear fashion, which I think it's what we would have expected. This figure is also going to be very useful when we try to quantify or give a sort of economic meaning to differences in the gap. So I'm going to go back to this figure when I start describing variation across schools and within schools. Okay. And then the third validation exercise is not really validation exercise, it's just summary statistics, but we think they are reassuring. Here I'm just showing you the gap, the average gap for courses of different level. And what we see here is that basic undergraduate courses have the highest gap, followed by advanced undergraduate, followed by graduate courses. And we think that this is reassuring because intuitively, we might expect more advanced courses and even graduate courses to be more likely to teach the frontier of knowledge compared to basic courses that instead are perhaps more likely to teach the sort of basics or the classics in a given field. Okay, so we think that this is also sort of reassuring. All right, so once we have constructed and validated this measure, what we're going to do is we're going to try to describe how it varies overall as well as across and within schools. So the first thing we're going to do is we're just going to look at the distribution of the gap. So the gap by construction is the ratio of two quantities that vary between 0 and 1. So just for the sake of clarity, we're going to multiply all of our quantities by 100 just to have integer numbers, which we think are easier to work with, which is why here we see a distribution of something that has a mean around 95. This is the overall distribution. This is the distribution if we control for field by year. So if we control for field by year, the distribution becomes a little bit more compressed, which is basically to say that fields explain a little bit of the variation in this gap. Schools explain another little bit of this variation. Sorry, I am battling a cough. Instructors explain a lot of the variation, and this is actually something we're going to go back to later. And then courses explain most of this variation. So basically what this is telling us is that there is a lot of persistency in the content of a course over time. So, it's not like every year the content of a given course gets updated completely from scratch, which is, something that those of us who have taught can perhaps relate to. So this exercise that I did, just controlling progressively for fixed effects, gives results that are somewhat sensitive to the order in which we add the fixed effects. So what we can do to be a little bit more rigorous is a Shapley decomposition, which is based on this notion of the partial R squared, which does not depend on the order in which we control for things. If we do this type of exercise, we see that schools explain approximately 2% of the total variation in the gap. So not a lot of it, but some. And instructors are what seem to explain the most of the variation, between 40 and 50%. Okay, so we're going to be focusing on these two elements going forward. So we're going to start from the schools, and in particular, we're going to try to understand how the gap, we're going to focus first on the variation across schools. We're going to try to relate differences in the gap with the differences in observable characteristics of the schools. And then we're going to do the same thing with observable characteristics of the students that are enrolled in each school. So this figure here shows you the correlation of the gap with a set of school characteristics. Here at the top, I'm showing you institutional characteristics. All these correlations are controlling for field by course level by year effect. Everything I'm going to show you so far is conditioning on these fixed effects. So essentially, we're not comparing engineering courses at MIT, graduate courses with undergraduate courses in English literature at the liberal arts colleges. We're going to be comparing, engineering graduate level courses in different institutions in the same year. So what we can see from this figure is that public versus private does not seem to explain a lot of the gap. There is no statistically difference, not statistically different from zero difference in the gap between institutions that are public compared to private. We also don't see that schools such as liberal arts colleges that are perhaps, in the mind of many people, thought of being more likely to teach the classics. They don't seem to have a significantly higher gap. If anything, they have a slightly lower gap compared to the others, although the difference is not significant. What we do see is that institutions that are classified as R1 in the Carnegie classification, these are very high research and intensity institutions. They're typically institutions that have PhD programs and people and enrolled faculty who are very research active. Those schools have a statistically lower gap compared to all the other schools. We also see that the gap correlates with the measures of expenditure and endowment, and in particular, schools who spend more on instruction, on research, and on faculty salaries, and that have higher endowments tend to have a lower gap. And then lastly, we see that schools that are compared to non-selective schools, which are the omitted category in the three coefficients estimated at the bottom of this figure, compared to non-selective schools, Ivy Plus and elite schools and highly selective schools have a significantly lower gap. So schools that are more selective tend to also have a lower gap. Okay, so this is kind of looking at the characteristics of the school overall. We're now going to turn to the characteristics of the students that are enrolled at each school. We're going to start with median parental income. So we're going to try to see whether schools that serve students who are more versus less economically disadvantaged also are exposed to education with different gaps. And what we do here is we're essentially binning schools in categories based on the position of that school in terms of median parental income in the distribution across all schools. Again, we're going to control for field by course level by year effects. So we're going to look at within these categories. And what we're going to see is that schools that have median parental income in the top of the distribution have a significantly lower gap. Of course, because a lot of these schools are the most selective schools, because wealthier students are more likely to attend more selective schools, part of this relationship might be explained by differences across schools in selectivity. Remember the correlation that I just showed you. What we do in addition is we control for selectivity tiers. And what we see is a relationship that becomes a little bit more muted in terms of magnitude but it's essentially still there. So even within selectivity tiers, schools that serve more disadvantaged students compared to schools that serve wealthier students tend to have a lower gap, tend to have, sorry, a higher gap. Let me go back to the differences in magnitudes, because I think it is important. So you might see here that schools in the top 1% have a 94.4 gap. Schools in the bottom 25 have a 95.6 gap. You might ask yourself, but what is the meaning of this difference? We can go back to the figure on the simulation that I showed you at the beginning. So this figure again tells us how much the gap changes as we replace its content. And an interpretation of the difference, for example, between schools in the top 1% of median parental income and schools in the bottom quartile is equivalent to, in order to make the two syllabi equivalent, we would have to replace 34 words, knowledge words in it, which are equivalent to approximately 10% of the total content of the average syllabus, given the average length of the syllabus. Okay, we can do the same type of exercise looking instead at another dimension of student differences, and this is the share of minority students. These are Black and Hispanic students as a share of total enrollment for each school. We get a figure that is fairly similar. The differences are a little bit more muted, but we can see that schools that are majority minority tend to have higher gaps. This is true, although the results are a little bit more noisy, but qualitatively, it is also true within selectivity tiers. So schools that are more likely to enroll students who belong to a minority group also have higher gaps. Okay, let me see how I'm doing with time. Should I wrap up in 5 minutes? I can't hear you, Steve.
Yes, sorry. It'd be good to wrap up soon, so we've got time for questions.
Okay, so let me be very brief on the role of instructors. Instructors explain really a lot of this variation. Important things that I want to show you that I mentioned before is the relationship between the gap and the research productivity of the instructor. So here you can see just a raw correlation, just controlling for fields between the number of publications of the instructor and the education innovation gap. So you can see a negatively sloping relationship. Same thing as if we look at citations, same thing if we look at the receipt of government grants. So this is just a dummy for people who do receive a grant or not. Let me skip this. The other thing I want to show you is the gap by job title. So what this figure is telling you is that assistant professors are actually the ones that have the lowest gap compared, for example, to tenure, to associate and full professors, and also compared to adjunct and lecturers, which remember are a very big categories, the biggest category among the 6 that I'm showing you. So you know, the use of non-ladder faculty might also impact the type of instruction that the students get. And then very briefly on the relationship between the gap and student outcomes, what we do is we construct a measure of school level gap, sort of aggregating everything at the school level, calculating a school fixed effect. And then we correlate with a measure of student outcomes. We try to account for, you know, unobservables, but in particular observable differences across schools. So we control for all the things that we can observe at the school level. This is the unconditional correlation between graduation rates and the gap. You can see that it's pretty striking and it's negative. This is controlling for essentially a large host of observables. The relationship becomes a little bit more noisy, but it's still statistically significant and negative. Same thing if we look at income of students 10 years after graduation. This is unconditional. This is conditional, a little bit more muted, a little bit smaller in magnitude, but still statistically significant. And I'm just going to conclude because I want to leave time for questions. So what we do in this paper is we use the text of course syllabi to construct and estimate the education innovation gap to measure the extent to which the content of courses in higher education is close to the research frontier. And then we try to describe the variation in the gap. We find a role for schools and school observables. We find differences for students with different characteristics in the type of education that they're exposed to. And we also, I think, outline an important role for instructors in shaping the content of higher education. And as I mentioned briefly at the introduction, where we are going now, hopefully, is in trying to establish a causal relationship between our education innovation gap and the closeness of education to the research frontier and student outcomes in terms of primarily the labor market experience, but perhaps also other types of outcomes. Thank you.
Thanks, Barbara. That was really excellent. I've got a few questions, but I'll start with just one, and then we'll see who else wants to speak up. Throughout your analysis, a basic premise is that newness of syllabus content corresponds to in advance relative to older content, where newness is measured with reference to the similarity to articles in the journals of the field. That newness premise is a lot more appealing in some fields than others. So engineering, life sciences, physical sciences, maybe economics. It's far less obvious that it's a sound premise when we look at some fields like literature, where some people I think would argue that new just means different, not better. So I know you control for field and a lot of your stuff, but this is really a point about slope, not intercept. And I'd be keen to see two things. A, redo your analysis where the student outcome measures are related to your newness concept, which that's how I'm describing it. I realize it's what you call the education innovation gap. Relate that to the newness of syllabi content in fields where your basic premise is pretty appealing. So I'd really like to see that redone. But second, you have the data to evaluate this premise to a considerable extent, because you have 800 institutions, as I understood it in your data set. You've got 62 fields. And the question is, you can then go quite some distance towards evaluating whether the education innovation gap at a given institution, what really matters for student outcomes, is the gap in certain fields and not other fields. I mean, you've almost got enough data to do it field by field, but that's going to push the data too hard. You can certainly do it if you kind of coarsify your 62 fields a bit and then ask it directly. So I think that's a first order thing you need to think about, is this basic premise that runs through all the analysis as I see it.
Yeah, it's a great point, and it's one that we've shared, I think, since Song, feel free to intervene, but I think we've shared since we went into this project. And I think initially we went into this project thinking that we would just use STEM courses, but then we said, well, we have data on everything, why not look at everything? And I didn't have time, obviously, to show tables or numbers. I prefer to stick with figures because they're just easier to present. But in the paper, we do have tables where we break down essentially all the relationships that I showed you today by field. And I think in general, it is true that the relationships tend to be more muted or kind of like flatter for humanities, although this is not always the case. Because what we do in practice is, remember that in the table of summary statistics, I showed you 4 macro fields. Those macro fields are essentially business, STEM, social science, and humanities. These are, for simplicity, we've aggregated the field classification that we have in our raw data in that way. We see that the relationships are somewhat more muted for humanities. We don't always find that the relationships are stronger for STEM, for example, which I think would be everybody's prior. Sometimes we find, for example, in some cases, we find that, the relationships are a little bit stronger for business. In some cases, we find that they're stronger for STEM. Humanities tend to be a little bit more muted, but it's not like there is nothing there. If what I'm saying makes sense. So we certainly have done as much as we can, I think, to disentangle or at least to allow for differences across fields, but we don't see these relationships disproportionately coming from, say, scientific subjects or business or this kind of thing. Now, the relationship with the outcomes, I think it's you know, I am very curious, and hopefully we'll be able to give you an answer soon on this, but I am very curious to see whether even just the correlations between the gap and the outcomes are stronger for students in certain fields, or, you know, even if the sign reverts for students in humanities. This is not something that we can do at this point, because unfortunately we have the student outcomes aggregated at the school level, and we don't have the breakdown by major. So we can't say what was the average income of students who graduated in 2016 from, say, Harvard in English literature versus economics or something like that. But it's hopefully something that we'll be able to look at more closely when we have the individual level student data.
Yeah, and I understand it'd be great to have individual level student data, but as I understand it now, that you're implicitly giving equal weight to all fields.
Yeah,
and
we are.
You can when you're looking at the school level student outcomes, you can certainly depart from that assumption, and you can let the data inform you to some extent about how you might most efficiently depart from that assumption. So that's even without individual level student outcomes.
It's true, but I think that so I think you can write a model in which, instead of having one correlation between a gap and student outcomes, you might have 4 different correlations of 4 different gaps, one for each field, and student outcomes. The way that student outcomes are going to be aggregated, though, is going to depend on the weight that, say, STEM students have in the calculation of average graduation rates, which is presumably going to be different between, say, MIT and another school.
But I understand all that, but all I'm saying is you are making an implicit assumption in that respect already. So, you know, and then, so it's not like you can escape this issue. You're making an implicit assumption. And I'm saying evaluate that implicit assumption, see if the data help you improve upon that implicit assumption. We can definitely do that. We are definitely making this assumption. Yes, Song, please.
Can I jump in a little bit? I think I agree with what Steve said, and also I think, as Barbara said, we're trying to get a more detailed individual level data to get that. Actually, this morning we were talking about exactly the new project on this as well. So I do want to offer 2 thoughts here. I mean, I think Steve really started a very interesting conversation about this by field and so on. The 2 points I want to make is about how this gap are capturing different aspects of teaching in different fields. And the second is, how should we think about the student outcome and what they learn in school, specifically in the places where you think they're not learning the hard skills like the science and so on and so forth. The first one is that even though we do not see the core of certain stuff being like changed that much, I mean, in history, 20 years, how much can we change in the facts of history and so on, right? We are like we have 220,000 years of history that we study, and then the extra 0.1% doesn't really matter that much, but we do see different type of views that were introduced into this. For example, how do we start to actually reinterpret or rethinking about the slavery period? How should we think about the wars and so on? All those things, and even in journalism, right? How should we think about journalism? How should we think about all those different kind of things? Do they actually keep evolving in social science and humanity? I think that is something that we definitely can pick up in our syllabi, and that's kind of part of this why this kind of fields still see this kind of gap. The second is about, I mean, basically, I think we are curious about what the data say about like STEM versus humanity or social science can explain more student outcomes and so on. But there's a countervailing force here. That is, there's recent study that shows, well, even though you think STEM measures has an immediate put to use, right? But the depreciation of those knowledge are also very, very high. in the labor market. Well, for the soft skills and people who learn like philosophy, thinking, and so on and so forth, those kind of shelf life of those are actually particularly long, and therefore like there is a little bit of a countervailing force here and there in terms of affecting student outcome. Maybe learning some very, very good and new up-to-date soft skills and so on in certain type of non-STEM courses are actually very, very helpful for a lot of people going forward, right? I mean, because Steve Jobs even said like two of the most important courses that he took at Reed, one is actually a design course, the other is I think it's kind of writing calligraphy type of courses and so on. So I'm just trying to say like conceptually, there's definitely an interesting tension that we should test there.
Okay, great, thank you. Justin, you want to go ahead?
Yeah, I was hoping you could talk a little bit more about making the gap a ratio. I know you discuss it in the paper, and you're worried about these, syllabus-specific idiosyncrasies. On the other hand, one might be worried that you're grouping together syllabi that have two very different profiles. One is a syllabus that sort of is disconnected from the research field or has the instructor's very idiosyncratic view of what the field is, and isn't particularly close to research published 15 years ago or now, and a different syllabus where you have a researcher who is sort of balancing research published 15 years ago and now, but is really attentive to where the literature is and where the field is. I think the ratio would group those together, and you might be a little bit worried when you start correlating these to outcomes that those could have very different effects on how what students are going to learn from the course.
Yeah, I think this is a fair concern, and it's one that we also had. Towards the end of the paper, of course, I didn't have time to cover this in the presentation, but towards the end of the paper, we play around a little bit with alternative measures, essentially using the same data, but just constructing our measure of novelty in different ways. And one in particular that I like, we used to, but one in particular that I like is just the share of new knowledge that a syllabus contains without a denominator. So basically we take all the words that are in the, say, top 5% of frequency across all papers at T-1 in a given field, and we count what share of those words are covered in a syllabus. And that measure is, I think, less sensitive to or less prone to the concern that you just described. It also addresses the fact that something that I actually was concerned and that I bugged Song a lot about, which was the fact that you could have two syllabi that cover the same new content. One is just a syllabus of a longer course that also can afford to cover old content, but both of them are covering the same new content. The longer syllabus is inevitably going to have a higher gap, but it's not obvious that we should treat it as being less up to date. And that's why we came up with this like share measure as opposed to a ratio measure. And we have the results in, I think most of them are in the appendix, but they're everything essentially goes through with slightly different magnitudes, obviously, because the interpretation is a little bit different, but they go through.
Yeah, basically that new measure is trying to capture the idea that where at the boundary did you reach, right? By looking at the very end, like the very furthest point that you can reach is kind of another measure for that, but they are highly correlated in this sense as well.
Great. We've got a question from Ramona. I'm just going to read it, Ramona. It says, how much detail are you obtaining from the NSF grants in your analysis? And are you able to get down to other personnel, I guess beyond the principal investigators, usually counted as numbers and not named individuals?
So Song, you might know more about the NSF.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not exactly sure what the other personnel's meant in Ramona's question, but what we could get in this is that we get the PI and co-PI that we consider as the important faculty investigators in this sense. And that's so far what we've been using. But I mean, we are not a particularly big expert in this field, and that was the most intuitive starting point for us. As Barbara said, this is the first time we ever showed this result. We just kind of cleaned our bar today. So therefore, if Ramona, you have any suggestions on how we should improve that, we'd be very happy to hear. But just to reiterate, at this moment, we're using PI and co-PI and co-investigators, basically.
Okay, great. Thank you. So let me ask you a different question. This is beyond the scope of what you've done so far, but I'd love to see something, and maybe you can tell me you're going to do this, or it can be done, or it can't be done, that relates the the education gap or the newness of the content of the fields to where people end up working in among firms we might think of as part of the innovation sector. Okay, so I don't know whether it's feasible. Can you go to Facebook, Google, Intel, Microsoft? Is it possible to scrape information about where their employees went to school, and then classify you can go to patents. You can see the patents that these firms obtain, and I picked them. They're among hundreds of firms that do quite a bit of patenting. And is there a connection between, so if you went to university and in your field, the professors were teaching advanced courses that were really on the frontier, is that where and the frontier's artificial intelligence? Are those people ending up at Google and Facebook and so on? It's something about the allocation, how this education innovation gap relates to the allocation of human talent to innovation intensive firms. Is that something you're thinking about? Is it feasible? I don't know whether you could just go scrape this information or not. I have no idea.
I mean, my first hunch would be to try get information from LinkedIn. That could be a starting point. And I think, I have a hard time thinking about another source of data that will give us this level of granularity, because the data that we were planning on using in terms of student outcomes that we're playing around with right now is essentially gets labor market information from unemployment records, and you typically don't have the firm there. But one could get a little bit more creative, especially if you're interested in certain types of fields. And perhaps, LinkedIn would be one avenue. I know that LinkedIn is not very popular among academics, but it seems to me that it's quite popular for people who work in the private sector. So,
is LinkedIn readily scrapable? I mean, do they make it easy or hard or what?
I have never tried. Yeah, go ahead, Sung.
I thought like this, I think through some formal application process, they do.
Yeah,
I think they do have open venues for researchers to use. And one thing we did try at this is like there was a course measure, like basically pretty like not detailed measure of inventors at the school level. That was I think that was one of the recent papers about who became inventors and so on at the university level. We found reasonable correlations, but after controlling for a lot of things, we just didn't get a very robust result at that moment. Therefore, I think individual level analysis would definitely be a lot more reasonable. That's also part of our analysis plan, not only on entrepreneurship, but innovation, but also on entrepreneurship and this kind of growth driving occupations and so on. Are they correlated with what they learn in school?
But I agree that I would love to be able to do this.
So I have a really basic question. You showed this chart that said your innovation gap measure is very highly correlated, almost over the entire range, with the age of references in the syllabus. That makes you wonder, well, how well would age of reference do if you just got rid of all your cosine similarity stuff, which is obviously way slicker, but if all the results essentially go through with age of references by field, I think by field here is important. You should tell us that, because it means that a lot of the work you did, while admirable and helpful in figuring this out, maybe the next study or a study in some other country doesn't need to do that. Just if age of reference does all the work. So does it?
I think there are two answers to this. The first one is they don't do all the work because only 30% of the syllabus actually has an active reference list in this case, but all of them actually has a course description and so on and so forth. The second is actually it's easier to do core science similarity and so on than coding up all those reference interests. Because for reference interests, you will need to map to publication records, you need to find the right year and so on and so forth, without giving us the right coding and so on.
All right.
I mean, even though we only kind of discuss it very briefly, actually the work going into that validation test is actually a much bigger pain than using similarity.
Right.
That also shows us the power of the cosine similarities.
Yeah. No, that's a pretty effective disposal of my question.
Yeah.
I have a related follow-up on it. It seems this sort of like model of linking back to journal publication or top publications could work really well in computer science, where the sort of lag between paper writing and paper publication and that frontier is very tight. But if I think about econ, it seems like there's a much longer lag, and we're seeing a lot of, certainly we put a lot of working papers from economics on the syllabi I produce. It seems like that would be a challenge where the publications that come out could actually be lagging the sort of frontier knowledge in the field by, 2 to 3 years. And just I wasn't sure how to think about that.
Yeah, I think it's something that, we can't do much about, except for, again, avoiding to compare things across fields, which I think we do across the paper, especially when we do the instructor analysis. Also, something that we're really, that is really in our mind is making sure that we account for differences in the publication process. But this obviously also directly affects the construction of the gap and how you establish where frontier knowledge is. So, we share the view. It's a little hard to think about how, what the implications of this would be. But we try to kind of keep fields separate as much as we can.
I guess the thing that I wasn't sure about how it would shake out. So could it be that a syllabus from economics could be perceived as having a bigger gap, but actually be more innovative? If the most recent work that it includes are all working papers and those sort of fall out. Another syllabus that had the sort of same, sort of like benchmark, classic papers, but then use just published work. So it's like lagging 3 years could appear to have that smaller gap. I guess that was a concern I got a little worried about.
Yeah, it could be the case, although, conditional on there being some persistency from year to year in the content of papers. So presumably, working papers that do not show up in our syllabus are more similar to papers at T-1 than they are to papers at T-15. So maybe that is, alleviates the concern a little bit more. But of course, the extent to which, those missed papers are important in terms of determining the total content of the syllabus might still impact the overall interpretation. My guess is that if there is enough persistency, then the difference would not be that big. But of course, it's hard to tell how much that actually would be. I guess we could take a quick, a closer look at how quickly the content of published works evolves over time to get a sense of, to sort of extrapolate from that a little bit.
Have you looked at whether there's much of a spatial correlation between the smallness of the education innovation gap in certain fields and the geographic location of firms that innovate in those activities?
So we haven't done much in that dimension, and it's something that's always been, I think, in the back of our minds when we started this project. Because one thing that we wanted to do when we started this project was also to sort of relate this measure with some measures of labor market demand for certain types of skills or certain types of knowledge. But then, as we started working on this part of the paper, that part grew and grew and grew. And so we feel like, in the current version of the paper, probably there isn't enough space, but hopefully, we'll do something. I think when we do something that is more closely related, not just to, labor market outcomes, but more to like the demand, the skills and the types of knowledge that are in high demand in a labor market, then we have to go local probably, because a lot of students, perhaps not all of them and not the ones from the elite places, but a lot of students from, say, public universities are actually, I think, pretty likely to kind of stay in the commuting area. So we could also, in that sense, I think the local dimension is going to become really important. But we haven't done, I think, anything so far, no song.
And also I think another kind of spillover of this question would be actually do industry knowledges and so on feedback to academic institutions as well, because this kind of communication is two-way, like being close to do we actually see they have better access to expert faculty and so on, because for example, I know I teach entrepreneurship and entrepreneur finance in Yale, and I know my Stanford colleagues don't need to teach their own courses because they have so many people that they can invite to guest speak. And just joking aside, I think that's a different hypothesis we can test along that line as well.
All right, I think we'll wrap up the recorded session here. Let me briefly thank Barbara and Song. We're going to stick around, but thank Barbara and Song, and also I want to thank Kathy and Tara who make things happen behind the scenes. So thank you.